Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Hope you're getting ready for Memorial Day weekend. Oh, my goodness. Please be safe, everybody. If you're going to drive, if you're going to fly, be careful. Be safe if you're going to have a staycation. Pull in some people you love, maybe some people you don't know, so that they can be with people. I think that more than ever, we need each other and we need to embrace one another. I'm Santita Jackson. It's a joy to be with you today here on the Santita Jackson Show. And as my morning stars come to me from all over the country, indeed, many of you are coming from around the world, I'm so glad that you're here. And please continue to come in and thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up, like and share the show. Hey, Bernadette, you're always the first girl. How you doing? Bernadette, sending you so much love today. You know what we need to talk about, at least in this hour? We need to talk about Gaza. There is a plan to move 1 million Gazans to Libya. Libya, unfortunately, has become a vassal state of the United States after we overthrew Gaddafi because we wanted his gold. He had one of the top 3 largest repositories of gold in the world. He had a debt-free country and among the richest oil in the world. It was a place that was coveted by the West. And because he wanted it for his people and he had enriched his people, he eliminated poverty in his country. He was killed. And our government was at the heart of it, sadly, tragically. And so now that Libya is not a state that failed, it's Libya is a state that was collapsed. And we collapsed it so that we could own it. Now they are trading Black Libyans, dark-skinned Libyans on the auction block, and they're selling them as slaves. That's what's happening in Libya. And it is in this context that the United States and Israel want to send. President Trump has said, okay, 1 million of these Gazans can go to Libya. How is it that we're just arbitrarily, and it's not arbitrarily, we are choosing countries in Africa, no less, to send the Palestinians too, but the Palestinians are not leaving. They're refusing to go, and they shouldn't go. Why should they leave their home? Why? So let's talk about it, everybody. Let's talk about it. I want to talk with you today because we have frozen many Libyan assets, namely their money, since 2011, when we overthrew the Gaddafi government. And we have said, we'll release some of your money to you if you take them in. So you see Libyans negotiating, even though it has been publicly denied, it has also been stated by, the Mideast negotiator for the Trump White House, Steve Witkoff. Well, there's no daylight between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So let's just take it as an article of faith that this is something that the government is trying to do, even though right now a lot is being made of an alleged rift, a public rift between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. In fact, that is not true. There is no rift. There is a lot of grift because there are a lot of resources in Gaza. See, when they broke up the Palestinian community and put a group on the west and a group on the east, they gave them throwaway land, but only the Lord could make Gaza oil rich, mineral rich. So then Israel said, oh no, we want you back. Oh no, they said, no, we're going to stay right where we are. But we have leveled it, and we don't know how many people are buried underneath the rubble. The Lancet study says that it is well north of 100,000 people, and they said by the time Israel is done, it will be more than 500,000. Think about that. We need to bring that on because it's our money, Americans' money, not America's money, but your money, my money, that's funding this. Mm-hmm. So I said, let me bring on someone. I wanted to give you all a frame for this as we bring on this brilliant young scholar, Curry Peterson Smith, Institute for Policy Studies. He's the Michael Ratner Mideast Fellow. And I want him to really break this down for us and help us to understand what we're looking at. And why it is important for us to understand this and to push back. As Americans are now being told, as the president is negotiating this deal, to cut out, to really cut Medicaid. I mean, austerity. A lot of Americans, 34 million American children will have less to eat if this budget goes through. So they're looking for places to cut, but no one's looking at the Pentagon, which has failed 7 consecutive audits. When we're looking for waste, fraud, and abuse, I think you should start there. Let me go to this scholar. Everybody like and share, like and share. Meet me on Blue Sky. Hey, Matt, how you doing? He meets me there every day, bless his heart. Blue Sky, santitajackson.bsky.social, santitajackson.bsky.social, and at Santita J on YouTube. No, excuse me, on X, and on YouTube, the Santita Jackson Show where Bernadette is. Everybody come on over here. And the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. Please become my friend there. That's the only place where I can accept friends. Oh, my nephew, because see, I'm old enough to be his mom. That's right. Corey Peterson Smith, how you doing?
I'm grateful to be here.
Well, I'm grateful that we were able to catch up. I mean, help me to understand what we're looking at, because when this in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, it's just like at the beginning of COVID. You had a running tally of the casualties, of the deaths, of the killings. But what I think when the numbers got to be so egregious and Americans were so revolted by it, you saw that peeled back. But they're wiping out Palestinians by the hundreds every day, still. And so the Lancet study, their projection was, oh no, if they continue at this current rate, and this is a 2-year-old study, they said 500,000 of them, a fourth to a fifth of them will be wiped out. So help me to understand what we're looking at, because it is in this context as we bury this story, as the attempt has been made to bury the story. You hear 1 million, it's hard to imagine 1 million people. Hey, Carol Soskin, from another mister out there in Beverly Hills. 1 million people, they want to move them and put them inside of someone else's country. Right. I don't understand the Western mindset, but, I saw one of my favorite African commentators and authors. She said, Westerners come to the global South and they always come without a visa. So help me. What did you say, Michael? You said, unfortunately, # the horror is real. Guri, what is this? Are you surprised by this? And even though the White House is saying, and some people are saying, yes, this is a plan that's on the table. Others are saying, no, it's not. But it really is, isn't it?
Well, the report is from NBC News. They've done an investigation in which they've spoken with 5 government officials who have said, yes, this is something that is actually being negotiated. The White House has formally rejected it. They've said it's not true. The Libyan government has said it's not true, and the Israeli government has declined to comment.
Okay. Even though the Prime Minister said that now we're going to go in and we're going to complete the job, essentially. I'm paraphrasing him.
Exactly.
Now we're not going to stop. We want Eden Alexander, once he's released, and he was not a hostage. He's a prisoner of war.
Right.
He's a young American, right, Curry? I mean, because the classification of hostages, you think the people were kidnapped. No, these are people who were in the military, by and large.
Yeah. Well, yes, Eden Alexander was in uniform in the Israeli military when he was taken captive. So yes, he's legally a prisoner of war. So yeah, there's a lot of we could say a lot about the conversation here in the U.S. And how Israelis are being talked about versus how Palestinians are being talked about. I mean, the main point, the essential point, is that this is a genocide that's taking place.
What is a genocide? What is that?
Yeah, I mean, there's an Israeli effort to systematically kill and displace as many Palestinians as possible. They're killing them physically. They're removing them from their land, and they're targeting Palestinian culture, quite explicitly. I mean, every single university in Gaza, every single university has been destroyed. They have targeted mosques. They have targeted churches, and other cultural institutions. They've targeted the schools. So these are the places where people are socialized and acculturated, to be Palestinians. In addition, of course, to the other places that sustain physical life, like all of the hospitals and clinics being targeted. Food is being denied, water is being denied, electricity is being denied. All of these things are true. So this is genocidal. That's not a matter of my opinion. This is the International Court of Justice has issued a ruling saying that there's plausibly a genocide taking place. And they have called upon the states of the world to take appropriate action, which the United States and Israel have refused to do. They are continuing to carry this out. So that's really the backdrop. And there is a long-standing plan, again, quite explicit throughout the history of the project, that is called Israel, to forcibly remove Palestinians from their land, to both do that and to deny the existence of Palestinians. So Prime Minister...
Because our ambassador has said there's no such thing. That's exactly Mike right. Huckabee, former Governor Mike Huckabee, he said there's no such thing as a Palestinian. Now, background, he's a Baptist minister. Mm-hmm. And so clearly is a Christian Zionist.
Yes.
And so he's reaching into that particular, I would say that's also a political position. He said it's Judea and Samaria. There's no such thing as Palestine. What do you say to that? How do you look people in the eye and tell them that they don't exist?
I don't know how he does that, but there are millions of people in the world who are Palestinian. So, it's like the fact is that Israel, it's ironic because Israel is constantly talking about what they call a demographic threat, and that is a reference to the existence of Palestinian people as a nation and the fact that Palestinians continue to exist. They continue to have children. This is an Israeli term, demographic threat. So, there can't be a demographic threat for a demography that doesn't exist. Obviously, the Palestinian nation exists. What I would say about Mr. Huckabee and his words, there are no Palestinians, just as a blanket statement about Trump administration officials, they're drawing on things that others have done and said. Mike Huckabee is not the first to say this. Respectfully, these people are not that creative, that they are inventing these things. And so the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir famously said, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. This has been from the start.
But then she called herself a in a 60-minute interview. What? Honestly, genuinely, right. And that's why I need you as a scholar of this region, to help me and all of us to understand, because we hear yes, we hear no, we hear no, we hear yes, we hear white, we hear black, we hear okay, no, gray, no, it's white and black, and then it's fused together. We get a lot of different signals at the same time.
Right. Yes. So let's break it down, because the state of Israel, it's not just a place where Jewish folks live. It is defined as a Jewish state. And that's different from, a place that happens to have large numbers of Jewish people. Legally, written into what are called the basic laws, which is the closest thing that Israel has to a constitution, they privilege the rights of Jewish folks over anybody else. There's this thing called the law of return, which says that any Jewish person in the world has the right to go to Israel and become a citizen. So there's all kinds of laws and there's all kinds of practices that privilege Jewish Israelis. Now,
but let's be more specific. European Jewish people, because when African Jewish people go there, the Ethiopians are having a horrible experience there, right?
That's right. So this will be familiar, actually, I think, to those of us like you and I, U.S. citizens. There's citizenship, and then within citizenship, there's a range of actual rights. And so on paper, just like on paper, I'm a U.S. citizen, but as a Black American, historically and today, the way that I actually, what it actually looks like legally to be in this country, legally, socially, politically, economically, in terms of my health outcomes, I'm not actually a full citizen, right? And so similarly, Israel on one hand has defined citizenship in Jewish terms, essentially. I mean, there is a minority of Israeli citizens who are Palestinian. These are the people who survived, the establishment of the state of Israel and survived the massacres and forced displacement of Palestinians, which I'll talk about momentarily. But for the most part, what it means to be a citizen in Israel, one has to be part of the Jewish nation to access what they call the Jewish nation, to access the full rights of citizenship. However, within, again, what they call the Jewish nation, there is a range. And at the top of a hierarchy are Ashkenazi Jewish folks, Jews who are directly from Europe or the descendant of European Jews, including Ashkenazi Jews from North America, like the U.S. And then there are Arab Jews who are, or Middle Eastern Jews from the Arab world and from Iran who live in Israel and who have less rights, who have fewer rights in practice than white folks. And then, yes, at the bottom, are African Jewish immigrants as well. So that's all real. So even within the idea of a Jewish Israeli citizenry, there's a hierarchy. But of course, that entire hierarchy exists above the indigenous people of that place, who are Palestinians. And Palestinians exist in their millions, and as long as Palestinians exist there's this problem for Israel, because they have basically defined Palestinians out of the Israeli nation. They're saying these people don't belong. This is actually Jewish land. It's a Jewish state. And so as long as Palestinians exist as a nation, it presents this problem. And that's why there has always been an effort to dissolve Palestinians as a nation, to get Israel to be recognized as legitimate in the eyes of the international community, while Palestinians are considered illegitimate, to consider Palestinians refugees who should be resettled elsewhere, and to say in any number of ways that Palestinians do not have the right to claim this land. So
they're refugees in their homeland.
That's true. There are, if we look at the majority of people in Gaza, actually, the majority of Palestinians in Gaza are people who themselves were displaced from what is now Israel, or who are the descendants, the children and grandchildren of those people, right? So it's actually of the Palestinian population in Gaza, it's a minority who has been there for many generations. The majority of Palestinians themselves were displaced from elsewhere in Palestine. And many of them live in refugee camps to this day, camps that are being systematically destroyed now. In the West Bank, similarly, there are refugee camps, and the population, large numbers of it are people who lived elsewhere in Palestine and were forced out when the state of Israel was declared. There are also refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Jordan. In Jordan, the majority of the population is actually Palestinians, Palestinian refugees.
As the Queen.
What's that?
The Queen of Jordan.
Right, exactly. So what is let's say unique about the situation of Palestinian refugees, whereas there are systems to get refugees to relocate around the world, and many do. Palestinian refugees who live in these refugee camps, most of which are operated by the United Nations, there is a recognition that actually their refugeehood is a temporary situation, and that they should be allowed to return home to Palestine at some point. And one of the symbols, I'll say, of Palestinians is a key. There are Palestinians who you'll see images of Palestinians holding up a key. There are Palestinians who were forced from their homes in 1948 when the state of Israel was created, who kept the keys to their houses. And so the key is the symbol that says, we're going to return someday. And Israel can't accommodate that, because if Palestinians were actually allowed to return to their homes in what is now Israel, it would no longer be a majority Jewish, situation. They would actually have to negotiate the fact that the majority of people who live there are not Jewish, which further delegitimizes the notion of a Jewish-only state. So that's why the existence of Palestinians are such a thorn in the side for Israel, and the plan has always been getting rid of them. The current conversation is, what if we put them in Libya? And by the way, the Trump administration has floated other African countries too. They've negotiated with the Somali government. Mm-hmm. They've had talks with Sudan. What if we put them in Sudan? They are in conversation with a number of places in Africa. But the point is they want to get rid of Palestinians.
But let me ask you this. With these African governments with whom the United States have been engaging, are they getting pushback from other African nations? Because really the superpower on the continent is South Africa, right, because of its development. And they have been at the forefront internationally of the struggle to stop the genocide in Palestine and to, Israeli security on one hand and Palestinian justice on the other. They right. said, we don't have to choose. That's the piece that piece has been missing. That having been said, while South Africa has paid the price, they are unmovable on this piece. And so I want to know, are there other countries that would press Rwanda, Somalia, et cetera, to not accept the Palestinians? Not because they don't want to take them in and keep them safe, but they're like, right. No, they said they want to stay home and we support that. Or why? Well, first of all, why are Palestinians not moving? They won't move. And what's going on with the African nations? What kinds of pressures might they be facing? Or pangs of conscience? I don't know.
Yeah. Let's start with the first question. Why aren't Palestinians leaving? And it really is a rootedness on the land. In that way, Palestinians are like other indigenous peoples of the world, but it's really, there's something profound about seeing people bombed, seeing people, again, spoke earlier about every single part of Palestinian society is being besieged right now to make Gaza unlivable. And yet when the ceasefire was secured, the most recent ceasefire was secured a few months ago before Israel violated it and broke it again. When Palestinians from northern Gaza have been displaced to the south, and then there was finally a ceasefire, there were images of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians walking miles back to their homes, in the north, carrying whatever they had saved, in some cases carpets, in some cases their pots and pans, in some cases photos, but whatever piece of home they could hold on to, they held on to, and would return to where they lived, even if it had been bombed to rubble, and lay down their carpet and set up a kitchen and start cooking. That is a commitment to home that, I think that on one hand, many of us, if not all of us, can relate to a notion of home, an importance of place. But that level of commitment, I think, is difficult to relate to for those of us who live in this country. It's something really deep. So in spite of all this violence, Palestinians are staying. In terms of the other question about Africa and the different pressures on African states, this is really interesting, because I do think that Africa as a continent is at this kind of crossroads right now. And actually, I'll speak to that by switching gears a little bit away from Palestine and to the question of U.S. relations. The very first place that this Trump administration bombed, the very first kind of formal military operation that Trump administration carried out, was actually in Africa. They bombed Somalia in January. That was the first act of the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth.
Why?
What they said was that they were fighting terrorism, and that's part of an ongoing military campaign for many years that the U.S. has carried out with other forces, including Somali forces and Ethiopian forces, which I'm going to, or Kenyan forces actually, and Ethiopian forces, which I'm going to get to momentarily. So there's an ongoing thing here. For what it's worth, the forces that the U.S. claims to be targeting, like Al-Shabaab, which is an organization based in Somalia, the bombing has not diminished them. Actually, they have grown as the bombing has gone on. So there's a stated reason, and then that stated reason seems to not actually producing the stated result. But the point that I want to make is that the president of Somalia, instead of condemning the bombing, he actually thanked the Trump administration. He said, we want to thank President Trump, and we see this as a sign of our partnership in fighting terrorism. And indeed, the U.S. is training Somali forces. That is true, unfortunately, with a number of states across the continent, where actually there's a real set of if I would call them benefits, but there's a kind of enticement, that comes in the form of U.S. training, U.S. weapons, perhaps trade deals, which of course lots of countries are vying for with the United States right now. And the truth is, just going back to Libya, the truth is that Libya has been a site where Western countries have sought to dispose of migrants for a long time.
Why?
Well, there's why. First of all, because Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, these states do not want migrants to come in, and in the hierarchy of migrants in the world, Africans, of course, are near at the bottom. That's why they don't want folks to come in. And then in terms of why Libya, the kind of instability that you spoke to at the top of our conversation, especially unfolding since 2011, when the U.S. had a military intervention that was part of a process that, where now Libya has de facto 2 different governments. There's a lot of chaos. And in that context, people who traffic human beings, either trying to kind of the system that Americans will be familiar with folks being paid in Mexico to get folks to cross the border, that exists in Libya. Libya is a major point of departure for African migrants seeking entry into Europe, but also a slave trade, like you said, people being sold, auctioned.
Human beings today. In the 21st century, being auctioned into slavery, being auctioned into sexual slavery. That kind of thing, unfortunately, has been thriving in Libya, in the kind of chaotic situation of Libya over this past decade plus. And the European Union has had its own negotiations with the Libyan government to make sure that migrants are not allowed to leave Libya and get into Europe, and frankly, to deport migrants back into Libya. So this is a long-standing practice that, as with so many things, Trump is now making very visible and very loud. But this kind of thing has been tolerated. It's been tolerated. It's been carried out by Europe and the United States. It's been tolerated by the West, and it has to be said, it's been tolerated, by different African states as well. Keep in mind, there's a lot of U.S. special forces across Africa. There's a lot of drone bases across Africa. These things have all been negotiated. There's a lot of extraction taking place across Africa. Yeah. I did no, but to interrupt, I think it's important. Yes. That's where Libya becomes central to the conversation, because Gaddafi was the bulwark, He was the stay against that. He was the leader who stood steadfast and pushed even Liberia. Do not let AFRICOM in here.
Yeah.
And now we see General Michael Langley, black man, who's head of AFRICOM, who's really advocating for the overthrow, right, of Ibrahim Traore, who's really taken Africa and the world by storm.
Yeah.
Because he's become like Gaddafi and Sankara and Nkrumah and just, and Biko and all of these great freedom, and Mugabe and all of these great freedom fighters, right? And so Africa's, it's interesting how Africa is central to the conversation, but no one's talking about that, Corey.
Yeah. Well, that's part of, it must be said, that's part of why I think Africa is so compelling for Washington, for the European capitals. They see solutions to their quote unquote problems, the problems of migration, the problem of Palestinians. They see Africa as a place where we can dispose of problems. I mean, we remember how Donald Trump spoke about African countries in his first term, right? I'm not going to say it, but we remember how he talked about African countries. This is a place where you send people and things to disappear,
and yet you extract. You
extract. I mean, this, I was going to say. I mean, unfortunately, the equipment that you and I are speaking on, it has components that were almost certainly mined in the Congo region of Africa, right? Oil extracted from Nigeria. There's some a big part of my work is trying to identify the supply chains of weapons. The weapons that are being used by Israel against Palestinians. Well, a lot of those munitions actually they're using components that are mined in Africa first, and then they're brought to the United States and made into bombs, and then they're sent to Israel, and then they're dropped on Palestinians. So Africa has literally since the dawn of colonialism has been for the West, for Europe, and then for the United States, and other Western countries. This site of extraction, on one hand, take what we want, and then dispose of what we don't want.
I'm trying to help me to understand then. I mean, because, let me, before I ask you another question, because people have weighed in. Several people, Ashley King out of Memphis has said, thank you, Curry Peterson. Michael Brandon said, the horror is real, unfortunately. Bernadette Telfair has said, look, people pick and choose what they see in the Protestant Bible, absolutely. But these Bibles, remember, they've been overtaken by people who were slave owners. So the Bibles that we read are not the Bibles that came out of Africa. I mean, that's another show. David Minot II says Israel is inherently racist. It's been practicing racism, fascism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, kidnapping, torture, land and water theft, extreme humiliation of Arabs, Black Jews, and other people of color in Israel, and genocide since its inception in 1948. That is a mouthful, David. But Donna has a response. Donna Besser-Stone, and I thank you for listening, Donna, because I can see from her comment that this conversation might be unsettling for her. She said, Israel is for freedom, liberty. Stop bombing Israel and watch all peoples in the Middle East prosper. Refugees remain in Palestine only, she says, emphasis hers, because Israel allows them to enter. What do you say to that? I've given you like the range, right? But I think what Donna is saying, because Donna's not alone.
Sure, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so why don't you respond to her in particular, and then you can get to David. Donna is the counter. Her comment came after David's.
I appreciate that comment. And I guess maybe the question is what we consider freedom. I mean, the word freedom is, for better or worse, it's a contested term, right? I mean, in the US, there's all kinds of things that President Trump is doing right now in the name of freedom. In the Black freedom struggle, we have a different definition. And so I don't see, when it comes to the question of the freedom of movement, the freedom to live where you want, the freedom to be on your own land, the freedom to farm for Palestinian farmers, the freedom to go to school. I mean, all of those freedoms are severely restricted at best and really being destroyed by Israel. I don't see how any present or future of freedom would require the destruction of every single university in Gaza. Where's the freedom in that, or the systematic destruction of every medical facility in Gaza? So I would argue that, contrary to being a site of freedom, Israel right now is really, it's on the frontier of what war looks like in the 21st century, and ways of killing people, particularly using the most advanced technology. It's on the frontier of controlling people's movement, the opposite of freedom. That is, how do you contain people and make sure they don't access their homes? How do you make sure they're not allowed to cross borders? Israel is really perfecting that, which is why the U.S. uses Israeli technology on the U.S.-Mexico border. The U.S. uses Israeli surveillance technology. The U.S.
police.
In the U.S. police departments, every single major police department in this country trains with Israel. Every single one. So, if you look at the practices of what the police in this country have been doing, and you see that as contrary to freedom, which I hope you do, then I would ask the question, why are they training with Israeli forces? All of them. Again, not like one, not just NYPD, not just Chicago. Every single major city in this country has sent their police to train with Israel. Why? Because they are practitioners in controlling people through violence. That's what Israel is really. That's their main industry. I'm sorry to say.
Well, but how is this shaping America's image in the world?
One thing that's fascinating, and this is kind of a breakthrough. I don't know if this was today or yesterday, but there was a joint statement by the governments of Canada, France, and the UK calling on Israel to stop this genocide in Gaza. I don't think they use the term genocide, but to stop its practices in Gaza. This is profound. These are countries that are long-standing allies of Israel.
Wait a minute. Creators, particularly the UK.
That's right. Literally.
This is a British construct.
That's exactly right. This, before what is now called the State of Israel, that land was under what was called the Mandate of Palestine, which was a British colony. It was a British colony, essentially, with British forces. And so, absolutely, if we're telling the story of how Israel as a state came to be, we have to talk about the British Empire, 1,000%. And we have to talk about Israeli collaboration with French forces in 1956. I mean, these are countries that have long-standing support of Israel, and even they have said this has to stop in Gaza. Now, I don't think that this is because of I don't think that this was a moral decision or a kind of change of heart. I think that there was a recognition that this genocide is so unpopular. It is at this moment kind of the moral question, and these states in particular, I bring them up in response to your question because it represents a certain tipping point where historically not only Israel's closest friends, but the United States' best friends are now breaking with U.S. policy as part of saving their own hides. Precisely because of the consequences of global public opinion and the public opinion in their countries, in the UK, in France, in Canada, and in the United States. The US population has finally joined the rest of the world in the majority of it saying the US should stop sending military aid to Israel. And so in terms of the US image in the world, obviously there's any number of things from the wild trade wars that are being declared to the horrendous practices of deporting folks, to El Salvador and Panama and elsewhere. there's all kinds of things that are tanking kind of U.S. prestige in the world. The fact that the government is attacking this country's own most prestigious universities, we could go on and on and on. But yeah, when the International Court of Justice, including an American justice in the ICJ, rules in favor of South Africa's case that yes, we think that Israel's plausibly committing a genocide, and the United States ignores it, is Israel's number one ally. Of course, that has consequences for how people perceive the United States.
Well, what's happening in the Arab world? And the president was just there, and much was made of the fact that he didn't call Israel first. Okay, at least that is the report. And much is being made, at least this is the report, that there's a rift between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I think we established at the top that that's not true. Steve Witkoff, the Mideast advisor for the White House for this administration, said there is no daylight between President Trump and the Prime Minister. And there is a disconnect between the Arab people and the Arab monarchies.
Mm-hmm.
And weren't they installed by the United States and British forces?
Yeah.
Really? Help us. Because I think we need to understand what we're looking at when we're looking at these people, because their politics are so far away from their people. And you see the unrest, and I see the uneasiness when the King of Jordan comes here. And, you see him trying to negotiate, but he's going home to a very disgruntled population.
Yeah.
Right? The United Arab Emirates, same thing. You can just keep on going around the Middle East, and there's a disconnect, but I guess you see it in our government too.
Sure.
There's a disconnect between the rulers and the people.
That's right.
Am I correct?
That's true. And truthfully, frankly, as I've gotten to travel around the world, I most of the places I go to, people say, of course, there's a difference between the rulers and the people ruled. They say it's honestly, it's you Americans who are confused. You identify with your government. They said most of us don't. So that's been an education for me, as I've gotten to travel, particularly in the Middle East, So that said,
but I think I don't think you can emphasize that enough.
Yeah.
Because when Israel says that they feel besieged, they actually are. They're not besieged by those who are in power.
Right.
They're besieged by the people.
Well, yeah, let's stay with that for a second.
The people in all of these countries do not support what they're doing. And it's not because they hate Jewish people. People don't care about that. This is a political fight. This is not a religious fight. This is a political one. This is about land and resources, everybody.
And first of all, it's a political fight in the sense that, again, the establishment of the state of Israel and every subsequent day of the state of Israel, has produced this refugee population. So, yeah, this is something going back to before 1948, and then the 48, the year that Israel was established, but it didn't stop in 1948. It continues, and obviously, what we're seeing in Gaza is the continuation. But it's also, these are like, if the cause of the Palestinians wasn't enough to compel people, Israel has attacked these states. Like Israel has had wars with Egypt, with Iraq, with Iran, which is not an Arab state, but Iran has also been targeted by Israeli violence, with Jordan, with Syria, so with Lebanon. So people, both for their sympathies with the Palestinians, but also by virtue of their own experience being attacked by the Israeli military. Yeah, there's a lot of sentiment against Israel among the people. Now, you rightly point out that the governments are a different story. I think that's important because there's this kind of myth that poor Israel, is this isolated state surrounded by all of these hostile neighbors. And the fact is, under the last Trump administration, they actually a number of those states formalized this in what they called the Abraham Accords. Mm-hmm. And normalized, they kind of recognize Israel.
And what were the Abraham Accords? But please explain what they are, because there was a sense of betrayal on the ground, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was a number of Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, the Sudanese government, actually, and Morocco, saying we recognize that Israel is a legitimate state. We want to have formal diplomatic relations with Israel, and that opened up the door to other things too, like trade with Israel, like having airlines fly between Israel and the UAE and Morocco, et cetera. And, not coincidentally, when each of these states recognized Israel and normalized relations with them, they all got something from the United States. For the UAE, it was this huge weapons package. For Morocco, it was, the U.S. signing off on Morocco's own occupation of the Western Sahara, the people of that territory, of that place. For Sudan, it was the Sudanese government, committing its atrocities. That was all of a sudden fine in the eyes of the United States. So that's what it was. And what was really critical was historically, Arab countries have said, if we're going to talk about relations with Israel, we have to talk about a solution for the Palestinians. That's been part of the package. What the Abraham Accords did was take the question of Palestinians off the table, said that Israel's going to do its thing with the Palestinians, meaning continue to displace them and oppress them. And separately from that, Israel can go ahead and have direct relations with these other countries. And they said, yeah, sounds good. That was really, it kind of made official what had been longstanding a practice of these countries for many years. There had already been security cooperation between Israel and the UAE, and it should say this flows too from a history of other Arab states recognizing Israel. So Egypt, recognized Israel back in 1979, immediately becomes the number 2 recipient of U.S. military aid after Israel. Jordan had a so-called peace treaty with Israel, which again resulted in a benefit in terms of U.S. military hardware and other gifts from the United States. So, these governments have for a long time been, at the very least, they've tolerated what Israel does to the Palestinians and have been really in alliance with the United States, which of course is the ally of Israel. So the idea that you have Israel on one hand and then all these Arab states on the other hand, it's just not true. In practice, there has been a situation where the Arab states have tolerated what Israel does to Palestinians.
How do they do that? I mean, that to me requires a certain kind of hubris to be this far removed from your people.
Right.
That to me is socially unsustainable.
It is, and they know that. I mean, that's what's really interesting. You think about the Saudi monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And there has been an understanding. I don't know kind of what the state of Saudi politics is at the moment. The current leader of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman,
Mm-hmm.
He has been making some interesting moves, over the past decade, let's say. So I would be curious as to what the popularity of that government looks like at the moment from its citizens. But for a long time, in every villa, of the Saudi royal family, there was a stash of cash and passports ready to flee. If people basically overthrew the government, and more
many here in the United States and they're throughout the world. I mean, they're not
exactly
like Hamas is in Qatar. They're not.
right,
Right?
exactly. And the truth is, you asked the
Who are
question.
they?
What's that?
And who are they?
Like the Saudi monarchy?
Who know the Saudi monarchy and Hamas? Because Hamas, well, let me just, because I know our time is going short, but like Hamas, you had the PLO historically with Yasser Arafat, who many of the Palestinians here, he was not popular with them because he was just too far off. He was just too far off on the freedom train. Like Dr. King was not popular with the Black establishment. because he was too far down the road on this freedom train. He wasn't. And Yasser Arafat was of that ilk.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you got, so as they were coming closer to statehood, Hamas comes up and Israel starts to fund them, right? And so my question is now, I know it's more complicated now, but who are they? Because, you know, they say they want to wipe out Hamas. I'm like, but every Palestinian is not Hamas. What are you talking? What is this? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Well, who are they? I don't know who the leadership are. You all know who the leadership are. You throw out a name. You tell me you killed them. Okay.
Right.
But you killed 300 or 400 other people with them. I mean, I'm trying to find out what is going on here.
Yeah.
Corey Peterson Smith, Mideast scholar, Michael Ratner, Mideast scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies. Because I am genuinely, like everybody else here, we are, as they said in The Color Purple, confused.
Well, you know, but I think actually, I mean, look, on one hand, like, really understanding a place, it's useful to, you know, I don't know, like, learn about it. I always encourage as much learning as possible. And yeah, I actually think that there are some frames where it's not so confusing, you know, which will be familiar. And so I'll just a brief sketch of the question of who is Hamas. You know, this is an organization that starts in 1987, you know, which is a time of great unrest of Palestinians. That's the year of the what was called the First Intifada, this huge uprising across Palestine. Hamas is an organization that is a resistance organization and a religious resistance organization. You know, kind of Islam is part of their politics and their political outlook. To really understand how Hamas got a foothold, I think we have to understand something that was called the Oslo Accords. This was a process that happened throughout the 1990s, which, like you said, this sort of end game, the supposed end game of this set of conferences, of conversations, was to produce a Palestinian state. That was the idea. And Israel said, okay, you know, we can talk about the idea of a Palestinian state, but we have a lot of conditions, you know. So let's talk about what those conditions are. Let's negotiate. And all the while that, you know, that Israel is at the negotiating table and the Palestinian Liberation Organization said, all right, let's try this. Let's try this strategy, you know. While that's happening, Israel is putting more and more settlers in Palestinian territory in the West Bank, and at that time in Gaza as well. There used to be Israeli settlements in Gaza too. They're increasing the number of Israeli Jewish folks, you know, in Palestinian territory. They're taking more Palestinian land because not only are you building settlements and building houses for these Israeli Jewish settlers, but then you're building roads between the different settlements to connect those settlements that only Jewish people are allowed to drive on, you know. So that's all happening through this process. So while at the negotiating table, the idea is we're pursuing a Palestinian state, in practice, Israel is actually taking more and more Palestinian land. And so in this process, Hamas is saying, we're not at the negotiating table. We're the ones who are going to keep on using military attacks on Israel as part of resistance. That's how we want to get a state. And whereas Hamas did not start out popular among Palestinians, over time they established credibility. And frankly, the Palestinian parties that were at the negotiating table lost credibility. So that's what we really, you know, in terms of where Hamas came from and why, you know, when there was an election in Gaza back in 2007, I believe, Hamas won. They won the election. It was because they had a certain credibility as the ones who refused to sit at the negotiating table with a colonizing power. Really briefly, on the question of what their leadership is, I think that history really frames that question, because there are individuals, of course, who are leaders in Hamas. They are being systematically killed by Israel, including, by the way, not just the military leadership, but the civil leadership. Ismail Haniyeh, who was the main he was the chief negotiator for Hamas. You know, he was at the negotiating table in Qatar and elsewhere where talks were held. He was assassinated. He was assassinated, and Israel all but claimed that assassination. They have claimed the assassination of any number of other Hamas officials. However, because in the very brief little history that I just sketched out, the whole reason for being for Hamas and the reason for its credibility in the eyes of Palestinians has been their refusal to, stop militarily resisting Israel. And because resistance is bred from colonization. I mean, you cannot colonize a people without there being some form of resistance. That is true whether we're talking about Sri Lanka. That is true whether we're talking about Tibet. I mean, there is always some form of resistance.
And the United States, the colonies, right?
That's right. Exactly. Absolutely. That's right. And the colonization of this place, indigenous people resisted. And people resist culturally, they resist all kinds of ways, including with armed force, right? And so because of that, until the colonization ends, there will be Palestinian resistance. It will take on different forms, but it will take on a form. And that's why you can assassinate, or Israel can assassinate, individual members of Hamas leadership. But the idea of resistance in one form or another, it's baked into, and the impetus for resistance is baked into Israeli colonization. So you can't murder it away. It's a fantasy that they can just kill every Hamas operative. This is not going to happen.
Can't kill an idea.
You can't kill an idea. And for what it's worth, the way Hamas operates, I mean, it's a really interesting, there's a book that folks may be interested in called Understanding Hamas. It's co-edited by a Palestinian scholar named Rami Khouri and another scholar named Helen Koban. And it's an interview with a bunch of scholars who've studied Hamas. One thing that they point out is that Hamas's leadership model is actually quite collective. They don't rely on any one individual. And so when one is killed, there are others who are ready to step in.
Thank you for the education. And we can continue on with this because I think this touches upon everything. Someone wants you to talk about the Afrikaners who've been Oh, no, that's another conversation. You don't have the time, because all of this is connected, because South Africa is being gone after because they are in league with the Palestinians. We have made Cuba pay because Cuba has been a reliable freedom fighter, particularly for Africans. And we just keep on going, and Venezuela too. So it's, and interestingly, North Korea. So it's not even interesting. It's just, these people resist being occupied and colonization. The last minute belongs to you.
Yeah, and there's a kind of, what there has been in the 20th century, especially, and going into the 21st, there's this vision that the United States has for the world, that much of the world has signed on to, in which the U.S. dominates, the West dominates, U.S. and Western corporations dominate, the U.S. writes these trade deals, et cetera, et cetera. And there's been a number of states that have refused to kind of integrate into that, and they're the states that you just named. I think that in the 21st century, we have to figure out going forward, what is out for those of us who are ordinary people who love freedom, I'll bring that word back. What is our vision, and not just for us located in this place called the United States, but uniting across borders with people all around the world. What is a vision of a more just world that we can all pursue? I think that is the question. And the question of a free Palestine has to be central to it, but freedom for a lot of folks has to be central to it.
Wow. A just society in a more peaceful world. That was the mission statement of the first Jackson campaign. And they put at the center of that campaign Israeli security and Palestinian justice at a time when you could not mention Palestinians. You had a no-talk policy. I look at my father today and say, what were you thinking?
Yeah, in the 80s.
About freedom.
In the
and
80s.
He said, and I don't regret a thing. But Carol Soskin says she thinks you're terrific. I think she wants to adopt you. She said, I would love to meet him someday. I hear Carol right now. I love her. Hey, everybody, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Keep up with Curry Peterson Smith, brilliant young scholar. Michael Ratner, fellow for Middle East at the Institute for Policy Studies. I'll see you all in a couple of hours as we talk with Norman Solomon of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting and Roots Action about original sin and Biden and all this other stuff. See you at 12 noon. But in the meantime, love you, Curry Peterson Smith. The Santita Jackson Show.